July 2006 in Missouri looked like any other American summer. Lawns buzzed with sprinklers, kids ran barefoot across hot pavement, and porch swings creaked under the weight of ordinary conversations. But in one neighborhood, a teenager named Melissa Carter, 19 years old, vibrant, sharp-witted, and on the edge of adulthood, was about to vanish in a way that would fracture her community's sense of safety for years. Before we dive deeper, let me say this clearly. The story you're about to hear is not just about a crime. It's about trust broken in the worst way, about secrets that lived in plain sight, and about how long it can take for truth to claw its way to the surface. If you want to hear the real cases that keep families awake at night, subscribe and stay with me until the end, because in this story every small detail matters. That Saturday began with nothing unusual. Melissa woke up late, wandered into the kitchen, poured herself a bowl of cereal, and left her dishes in the sink. She pulled on her favorite striped shirt, slipped into sneakers she had scribbled on with permanent marker, and threw on a denim jacket even though the heat was already heavy. It was habit more than anything else. Her comfort layer, her armor. She told her mom she'd be meeting her friend at the local diner, and then she left. No drama, no hint that it was anything more than another summer day. But by nightfall, everything ordinary had shattered. Her last text message was brief, almost meaningless on the surface. On my way. Harmless words, routine words. Yet they would later take on a haunting weight. Because she never arrived. She never sent another text, and by the time her mother realized the evening had stretched too long, panic began to slip into her voice. Her room gave no clue. Her purse and jacket were still there. Her wallet sat untouched, nothing missing, nothing packed. Her bed was unmade in the way it always was. This wasn't a runaway, this was something darker. Neighbors gave fragments of memory, details that on their own seemed small but together painted a troubling picture. One woman swore she saw Melissa smiling as she rode past, her bike bell chiming in the distance. Another recalled a dark sedan with tinted windows parked too long at the corner. And one teenager, washing his car, remembered something that would gnaw at him for years. Melissa standing on the sidewalk, speaking to someone inside a car, her posture uneasy, her voice too low to hear. He watched for a few moments, then looked away. "I thought adults were safe," he later said. When police arrived, the trail was already thinning. But within hours, they discovered her bike. It leaned against a fence on Maple Street, a place she had no reason to be. The handlebars twisted at an odd angle as if it had been dropped in a rush. Inside the front basket sat her backpack, untouched. Inside the backpack, a notebook filled with doodles, a granola bar, and half a bottle of water. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints, no discarded belongings. Just the eerie stillness of a bicycle abandoned on a street where it didn't belong. Dogs were brought in. They tracked her scent with mechanical precision from her house, down the street and straight to the bike. Then, suddenly, nothing. The trail didn't fade, it ended. It was as though she had been lifted off the earth itself. The handler later told reporters he had never seen anything like it. The investigation escalated fast. By midnight, local TV stations were airing her photograph. Detectives interviewed everyone on her block. Neighbors opened garages, sheds, and yards for inspection. Helicopters circled overhead with infrared cameras, scanning for body heat. Her family's world collapsed into chaos. Her mother sat by the phone, answering every call with desperate hope. Her father drove the roads over and over, headlights slicing the darkness, scanning every ditch and back road. Her younger brother refused to sleep in his room, curling up instead on her bed as though proximity might pull her back. The entire community joined in. Posters were stapled to telephone poles. Volunteers searched fields with flashlights. Church groups prayed in vigils that stretched late into the night. Strangers brought food to the family's doorstep, unsure what else to do. But behind the public show of unity, fear spread like wildfire. Parents who once let their children wander freely now kept them inside. Women who had walked confidently down their streets now checked behind them with every step. The town itself seemed to shrink, its trust poisoned by the possibility that a predator was among them. Theories multiplied. Was it a drifter passing through? Or was it someone local, someone who knew her schedule, Her routines, her trust. Detectives leaned toward the latter. The absence of struggle, the sudden cut off of her scent trail, the possibility that she got into a car willingly, all suggested she may have known the person. The days blurred. Every new sunrise brought thinner hope. Each night ended the same way. Her mother staring at the front door, her father in the dark with clenched fists, her brother whispering her name before sleep. Reporters came, then left. The national news cycle moved on. But in that town, the silence was suffocating. What no one realized then was that the answer to her disappearance wasn't far away. It wasn't buried in distant fields or hidden by strangers. It was lurking closer than anyone dared believe. And the person responsible wasn't just someone she trusted. It was someone the entire community trusted. And when that mask was finally torn away, the betrayal would cut deeper than anyone imagined. The search entered its second day with the kind of urgency that burns everyone involved, but by the evening, exhaustion began to replace adrenaline. Detectives expanded the radius, volunteers combed fields in organized lines, and police set up roadblocks, stopping cars, asking questions, checking trunks. Yet every effort ended the same way: nothing. Her bike remained the only real piece of evidence, an object that felt less like a clue and more like a mocking reminder of how quickly someone can vanish. It stood in photographs released to the media, leaning against the fence, handlebars twisted, basket full. Every reporter pointed to it, every broadcast replayed it. The image became iconic, an everyday object frozen in a moment of rupture. For Detective Janet Morrison, the case was quickly becoming an obsession. She studied the bike over and over in photographs, convinced there was something in the angle, in the placement, in the dirt smudges that others had overlooked. She stayed awake in the command center long after the other officers left, staring at maps spread across folding tables, her coffee cooling untouched beside her. Meanwhile, the family was unraveling. Her mother's voice grew hoarse from giving interviews, each one a plea for her daughter's safe return. Her father walked until his legs gave out, refusing to go home, refusing to admit there was nothing left to find. Her younger brother stopped speaking altogether, his silence louder than any scream. Neighbors began to remember small details, fragments of memory that trickled into the case file. Mrs. Henderson swore she saw Melissa ride past her garden that morning, her hair bouncing in the sunlight. Mr. Rodriguez thought he heard a car door slam around the same time. And Marcus, the teenager who had been washing his car, admitted he'd seen her talking to someone in a dark sedan. But memory is fragile, and each account conflicted. Was it before 10, afternoon? Was the car black or dark blue? Was she laughing, or did she look nervous? Detectives wrote it all down, even when contradictions piled high. Because sometimes, buried in the fog of human memory, a single truth waits to be noticed. The dogs were brought back a second time. They traced the same path, house to street, street to bike, and stopped again, confused, circling, whining. It was as though her presence ended in that exact spot. Detectives discussed possibilities. Maybe she had been lifted into a vehicle. Maybe she had entered willingly, thinking she was safe. Either way, the trail's abrupt ending haunted them. The media frenzy escalated. Cameras stationed outside the family's home. Reporters asking questions that bordered on cruel. Did she run away? Was there trouble at home? Was she seeing someone? Each theory spun into headlines, and each headline tore deeper into the family's grief. The truth was simpler and far more terrifying. She had not planned to leave. Her purse, her wallet, her jacket all untouched, her calendar filled with future plans, work shifts, friend meetups, family dinners. Nothing about her life suggested escape. Everything suggested interruption. Inside the police department, files grew thick. Every registered offender within 50 miles had been interviewed, every alibi checked, every suspicious vehicle report logged. But the stack of dead ends grew higher. And in the midst of it all, rumors spread. Some said it was a stranger passing through. Others whispered it was someone local, someone trusted. Because how else could she have disappeared so quietly, so cleanly, without a single scream loud enough to raise alarm? Detective Morrison leaned toward the latter. She'd seen it before, cases where the predator wasn't hiding in shadows but living in plain sight. Someone who could blend, who could disarm suspicion, Who could persuade a teenager to lower her guard? Meanwhile, the town transformed. Doors locked earlier, children forbidden to walk alone. The diner where she was supposed to meet her friend saw fewer customers, as if the absence of her laughter poisoned the air. Every empty seat, every quiet street corner carried her ghost. Her mother refused to use the phrase cold case. She kept her daughter's room intact, bed unmade, notebooks left open, as though freezing the space in time could somehow summon her back. Her father grew sharper, angrier, frustrated by the lack of progress. He called detectives daily, demanding updates, his voice cracking with helpless rage. And still, behind every search, every press conference, every vigil, one fact remained: someone knew. Someone out there carried the truth in silence. The most haunting detail, detectives would later admit, was the ordinariness of it all. This wasn't a late night alley, a dangerous part of town, a situation laced with obvious risk. This was daylight. This was a teenager riding to meet a friend. This was small-town America, where neighbors waved from porches and strangers smiled at gas stations. But evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits in quiet cars parked too long on corners. Sometimes it wears the face of someone you'd never suspect. Sometimes it's woven so deeply into the fabric of normal life that you don't see it until it tears everything apart. As the second week passed, the posters began to curl under the heat. The flowers left on the family's porch wilted, and the case, though still active, began to shift into that gray space detectives dread. No new evidence, no new leads, no breakthroughs. But in that silence, the truth hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone underground, waiting, buried like the darkest kind of secret. What no one knew then was that years later, a single discovery would rip the case back open and expose not only what had happened to her, but who had been hiding in plain sight all along. By the third week, the search no longer looked like a sprint. It had become a slow march of grim determination. The gymnasium at the local school, once filled with the energy of basketball games and summer camps, had been transformed into a command center. Maps stretched across tables, radios crackled with static, and tired volunteers signed in and out, their faces marked with exhaustion and quiet dread. Detective Morrison sat at the center of it all, eyes fixed on the growing case file. Each witness statement, each tip, each scrap of information was logged and pinned, but the threads refused to connect. She replayed the timeline again and again: Melissa leaving her house. The last text message, the bike found leaning against the fence. The story ended there, and every attempt to push it forward collapsed into silence. The FBI joined the case in full, their child abduction rapid deployment team arriving with specialized equipment and profilers. They brought hope, but also a stark reminder that this wasn't just a local tragedy anymore. This was now a federal case, and with it came the unspoken acknowledgement that they were likely searching for a body, not a living girl. Media pressure intensified. Television anchors repeated her story nightly, framing it as the latest chapter in America's epidemic of missing children. Photographs of her smile appeared across the nation, stapled to utility poles, shared online, flashing across screens in living rooms hundreds of miles away. But as coverage grew, so did cruelty. Strangers on the internet speculated wildly, some accusing the family, others spreading rumors that twisted the truth into something unrecognizable. Inside the Carter household, time warped. Her mother barely left the phone, clinging to every ring as though it might be her daughter's voice. Her father withdrew, pacing the backyard at night, staring at the empty porch where her bike once rested. Her younger brother kept her bedroom door closed, refusing to let anyone disturb the space where her presence still lingered. The community tried to keep faith alive. Candlelight vigils filled the park, hundreds holding flames against the dark sky, chanting her name. Pastors prayed aloud for her safe return. Children released balloons into the air, their tiny voices asking questions no adult wanted to answer. But beneath the unity, fear had carved deep trenches. Parents no longer trusted the town that once felt safe. Curfews tightened, doors locked earlier, and neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Detective Morrison focused on the dark sedan. Marcus's memory of the car at the corner gnawed at her. He had described it as black, maybe dark blue, with tinted windows. But without a plate number, it was like chasing a ghost. They checked hundreds of vehicles, interrogated owners, followed every lead, but the answer remained elusive. Then came the dogs again. Morrison requested a fresh team from another county, hoping new handlers might pick up something missed. They followed the same path from the house through the block to the bike. Then nothing. No trail leading further. No trace of where she had gone. "This is impossible," one handler muttered. "Scent doesn't just end." And yet here it had. Theories began multiplying. Maybe she had willingly entered a vehicle, someone she trusted enough to silence her instincts. Maybe she had been forced quickly, before she could scream. Some speculated she was taken to another state, hidden in plain sight, erased by distance. But the truth was no one knew. Weeks turned into months. Seasons began to shift. Leaves browned, then fell, covering the sidewalks where she once rode her bike. Halloween came and went, children knocking on doors in costumes while her family kept their porch light dark, unwilling to pretend life was normal. Thanksgiving passed with an empty chair at the table, Christmas with unopened gifts under the tree. The posters that once looked urgent now curled and faded under rain and sun. Some were torn down, others replaced with fresher copies, but each one carried the same question in her smiling face: where did she go? Detective Morrison refused to let go. She pored over evidence late into the night, studying photographs, interviewing witnesses again and again, hoping some overlooked detail might surface. She knew the statistics, but she couldn't shake the image of the bike, the abandoned backpack, the sudden stop of the trail. In the community, whispers grew darker. Some believed she was alive, hidden somewhere. Others believed her body lay undiscovered in the woods or the river. Parents warned their children never to talk to strangers, never to walk alone, never to trust the safety they once took for granted. What haunted everyone most was the ordinariness of it all. This wasn't a late night walk, a risky part of town, or a secret life hidden from family. This was daylight, a teenager heading to meet a friend, and she was gone as though erased from the world in plain sight. The case began to cool, though no one admitted it aloud. Tips slowed. Vigils thinned. Reporters moved on to newer stories. But for the family, the nightmare only deepened. Every day without answers became a wound that refused to heal. And somewhere, hidden within the silence, was the truth. A truth buried in basements, hidden in old houses, preserved in ways no one could imagine. Because what no one yet realized was that the man responsible hadn't fled. He was still there, still living quietly among them, still trusted, still unseen. And when the first real break finally came, years later, it would shatter the illusion of safety forever. Years passed, and her case slowly slipped into the heavy drawer labeled cold case. Detectives rotated in and out, files were reviewed, evidence boxes gathered dust, but in Boise, the absence of Melissa never stopped echoing. Her photograph remained taped to refrigerator doors, pinned on bulletin boards, remembered at candlelight vigils that grew smaller with each passing year. Her mother never gave up. She organized search anniversaries, contacted advocacy groups, kept her daughter's story alive in online forums where strangers debated theories deep into the night. Her father, however, grew quieter, retreating further into himself, unable to bear the reminders that offered no answers. Grief eroded their marriage slowly, until the two lived separate lives bound only by the memory of the daughter they had lost. Detective Morrison carried the case like a shadow. Even after she was reassigned, she found herself pulling the file out on Friday evenings, reading witness statements she had already memorized, staring at photographs she could no longer look at without feeling a personal ache. She knew there had to be something hidden in plain sight, something everyone had missed. Then, in 2019, more than a decade after Melissa's disappearance, fate cracked the silence. Construction crews were demolishing an old property not far from where her bike had been discovered. It was a place locals avoided, an abandoned house with peeling paint and broken windows. When the excavator clawed into the overgrown lot, its bucket scraped against metal. The operator stopped, climbed down, and unearthed what looked like a sealed container, wrapped obsessively in layers of plastic and duct tape. Police were called immediately. Detective Kevin Sullivan, who had inherited the case years earlier, arrived at the site with a mixture of skepticism and dread. At first glance, it could have been nothing, an old toolbox, discarded junk. But its deliberate burial and careful wrapping told another story. This wasn't trash, this was hidden. The container was transported to the state forensic lab. Under sterile light, technicians cut away the duct tape, peeled back the plastic, and opened the corroded lock. Inside were dozens of Polaroid photographs. 43 images, carefully preserved, each wrapped as if their contents were too precious to decay. What the photographs revealed froze even the most seasoned investigators. Melissa stared back from the prints, her eyes wide with fear. The images documented a progression, starting with her alive, frightened but unharmed, and ending in ways no one wanted to describe aloud. Each photograph had been staged with unsettling care. The lighting, the composition, the order. It all suggested someone deliberate, someone who wanted not just to commit a crime but to document it. The discovery turned the case on its head. Melissa was no longer missing. The photographs made that undeniable. But they also raised chilling new questions. Who had taken them? Where had they been shot? And why had someone preserved them so carefully? Buried but not destroyed. Forensic analysts went to work. The Polaroids were scanned and enhanced. Tiny background details began to emerge: wood paneling on the walls, a calendar with handwritten notes, a reflection in a mirror that revealed part of the photographer's hand. In one image, a utility bill sat partially visible on a table, the corner of an address just legible when magnified. Each clue was a breadcrumb leading back to a place investigators had overlooked for more than a decade. The paneling and floorboards suggested a mid-century house in a specific neighborhood. The calendar design traced back to a local print company. And the reflection showed a man's hand wearing a distinctive ring. Something investigators believed might tie to an employer's uniform. The evidence narrowed the search to fewer than 50 houses. Property records pointed to one man in particular, Thomas Weber, a maintenance worker employed by the local school district. He lived just blocks from where Melissa had vanished, in a modest ranch-style home with a basement that matched the photographs almost exactly. Neighbors described him as quiet, helpful, the type of man who shoveled snow for the elderly and fixed leaky gutters without being asked. He had worked for years at the very school Melissa once attended, blending into the background so completely that no one ever questioned him. Detective Sullivan began surveillance. Weber's life seemed dull, monotonous. He woke early, went to work, returned home, and rarely left at night. But beneath that routine lay the weight of what investigators now knew. With a search warrant in hand, police entered his house. The basement had been renovated since 2007, but the bones of the space remained the same. Forensic teams sprayed luminol, revealing faint patterns of blood beneath layers of paint. Strands of hair, preserved in the cracks of the floorboards, were matched to Melissa's DNA, and behind a false wall investigators found more photographs, more personal items belonging to children whose names had never been linked to Weber before. The mask shattered on April 8, 2019. Police arrested Thomas Weber at the school where he worked. Children stared through classroom windows as the man they knew as the janitor, the quiet helper, was led away in handcuffs. The shock rippled through the town like an earthquake. Parents who had trusted him, who had smiled at him in hallways, now realized they had been shaking hands with a predator. Under questioning, faced with photographs, DNA, and evidence, Weber confessed. His voice never rose, never cracked. He spoke in a monotone, describing how he had lured Melissa by pretending her parents had sent him to pick her up. How she had entered his car without screaming, trusting the authority he carried in his role at the school. How he had kept her for nearly a week before ending her life in the basement. The confession did not stop there. He admitted to other children, other disappearances, stretching back years. Names investigators had never connected now lay in the same shadow. For the community, the betrayal was unbearable. This wasn't a stranger passing through. This wasn't a nameless predator from elsewhere. This was someone they had known. Someone who had walked their hallways, fixed their classrooms, shoveled their sidewalks. The enemy had been within. When Melissa's mother heard the confession read aloud in court, she wept openly. Her father, hardened by years of waiting, stared at the man with eyes filled not just with hatred but disbelief. Because how could someone so ordinary conceal something so monstrous for so long? The courtroom was silent the day Thomas Weber stood trial. The man who had once blended into the background of everyday life now sat in a suit that did little to disguise the monster revealed beneath. Rows of townspeople filled the benches, their faces etched with disbelief, anger, and the weight of betrayal. Mothers clutched their children tighter, as if to guard them even now. Years after Melissa's disappearance, her mother sat in the front row, a framed photograph of Melissa propped against her lap. She did not look at Weber often, but when she did, it was with the hollow stare of someone who had carried a wound too deep for words. Her father sat beside her, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the bench as though the wood itself might splinter under his grip. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece. The photographs found in the buried container, the data recovered from the basement floorboards, the confession delivered in Weber's flat, emotionless tone. Each detail stabbed deeper into the community's collective memory. The photographs were not shown publicly, but their descriptions were enough to leave the room heavy with nausea. The defense had little to offer. There was no plea for misunderstanding, no claim of mistaken identity. The evidence was too overwhelming, the crimes too horrific. The only question left was what punishment a system of justice could deliver for someone who had stolen not just one life, but many. When the verdict came, it was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck like thunder, final yet unsatisfying. Because how could a sentence, however severe, balance the scales against crimes that had spanned years and left families with nothing but ashes? Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the town gathered in clusters of grief and anger. For some the verdict was closure, for others it was a fresh wound, a reminder of everything stolen. Melissa's mother spoke briefly to the press. Her voice wavered but did not break. She thanked the community, the investigators who never gave up, and the strangers who had kept her daughter's memory alive. Then she said words that would linger in the air long after the cameras switched off. "We got justice today, but we will never get Melissa back. And that's a truth I will carry for the rest of my life." The aftermath rippled outward in ways no one could ignore. The school district faced outrage. How had a predator worked among children for so long without detection? Policies changed overnight. Background checks grew stricter. Psychological screenings were implemented. And trust in the very walls of schools had been shaken. Neighbors who once prided themselves on knowing everyone in town now carried suspicion. If a man like Weber could hide in plain sight, who else might be lurking behind a smile? The annual vigils for Melissa shifted in tone. What had once been gatherings of hope became ceremonies of remembrance. The park where candles once flickered now held a permanent memorial, a garden of purple flowers, Melissa's favorite color, blooming each summer as a reminder of what was lost. Detective Morrison, long retired by the time of the verdict, attended quietly, standing at the back. She had carried Melissa's case file through years of dead ends, sleepless nights, and quiet despair. To see it finally resolved was both a relief and a devastation. Closure, she realized, doesn't always heal. Sometimes it only sharpens the edges of grief. For Marcus, the teenager who had once watched from his driveway as Melissa spoke to a man in a car, the trial brought no comfort. He told reporters that he replayed that moment every night, wondering what would have happened if he had walked closer, if he had asked a question, if he had written down a license plate. "I thought it wasn't my business," he said. But it was, it always was. The community struggled to reclaim normalcy, but normal had been forever altered. Parents still locked doors earlier, children still hesitated to ride bikes alone. And the shadow of Melissa's story lingered like a warning whispered from one generation to the next. The photographs haunted investigators most. The obsessive care with which they were preserved suggested not just cruelty but pride. Trophies, carefully wrapped, waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps never meant to be discovered at all. One FB profiler suggested Weber might have buried them as a way of preserving control, even beyond his crimes. A secret archive hidden beneath the earth, proof of what he had done, hidden until fate unearthed it. For Melissa's family, the years ahead would be marked by the cruel rhythm of anniversaries. Each July, the date of her disappearance reopened the wound. Each December, another birthday without her. Each milestone she never reached, college, marriage, children, became a ghost in their home, a reminder of what might have been. Her mother continued to speak at schools, telling children about trust, about danger, about paying attention to instincts. Her father moved away, seeking distance from the streets that carried too many memories. Her brother grew older with a quiet determination, vowing never to forget the sister who had once filled his world with laughter. And for those who followed the case, who had studied the photographs, who had walked the fields searching for her, one truth remained unshakable: evil does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a uniform, carries keys, shovels snow, and says good morning with a smile. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, trusted until the moment the mask cracks. As the prison doors closed behind Thomas Weber, the community exhaled, but it was not relief, it was resignation. Justice had been served, but justice is not the same as restoration. Melissa was gone, her laughter silenced, her dreams stolen, her family forever changed. And yet, her story endures, not only as a cautionary tale but as a reminder that vigilance matters, that silence can be deadly, that evil thrives when it is underestimated. So if you take anything from Melissa's story, let it be this: pay attention. Trust your instincts. Speak when something feels wrong. Because sometimes the difference between safety and tragedy lies in a single decision, a single glance, a single moment of courage.